On her very first morning as CEO, Olivia Bennett walked into the operations center and saw a man asleep at his desk. His head rested on folded arms, while dozens of monitors around him flashed with system alerts and scrolling logs. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't check the screens or give him a chance to explain. In front of the entire technical team, she ordered security to confiscate his access badge and fired him on the spot. Andrew Foster barely had time to lift his head before she cut him off. What Olivia didn't know was that Andrew had spent the previous 48 hours fighting a sophisticated cyber attack without leaving the operations floor. Exhausted after keeping the company's payment infrastructure alive through sheer experience and determination, he had fallen asleep for only a brief moment. Within hours of his dismissal, the fragile defenses he had built would begin to collapse, pushing the entire company toward a crisis no one else knew how to stop. Watch until the end to see why firing him became her biggest mistake. Andrew Foster was a senior systems engineer at Aurelius Pay, one of the largest financial technology companies in the country. Every day, the company's infrastructure processed thousands of corporate payments, wire transfers, and authentication requests. Even a brief outage could cost millions of dollars and damage the company's reputation. Although Andrew's title sounded ordinary, his role was anything but. At 34 years old, he had spent years learning every layer of the company's aging infrastructure. He understood outdated APIs, fragile failover systems, undocumented security patches, and hidden dependencies that had accumulated through years of upgrades and emergency fixes. To most employees, he was simply a quiet engineer who rarely spoke. To the system itself, he was the person who understood how everything stayed together. Outside of work, Andrew was raising his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, alone after losing his wife several years earlier. His life followed a simple routine. He worked hard, went home to Chloe, and stayed away from office politics. He never tried to draw attention to himself or build influence inside the company. His only priorities were keeping the systems running and providing a stable life for his daughter. At the same time, Aurelius Pay was entering a major transition. 29-year-old Olivia Bennett had just become the company's new CEO after her grandfather stepped away from leadership. Intelligent, disciplined, and determined to prove she deserved the position, Olivia immediately announced stricter standards and a complete cultural reset. She believed the company had become too comfortable and intended to restore accountability from the very beginning. What Olivia did not know was that a serious threat had already entered the company's infrastructure. 2 days before her arrival, Andrew noticed an unusual pattern hidden inside the transaction authentication logs. At first, it appeared to be a handful of harmless requests moving through the international payment system, but the timing and behavior were too precise. Someone was quietly studying the network rather than trying to overwhelm it. After tracing the activity, Andrew discovered that attackers had gained access through a secondary authentication relay connected to cross-border payment verification. Instead of launching an immediate attack, they were slowly exploring the company's architecture, searching for the right opportunity to reach more critical systems. Andrew immediately reported the discovery to his manager. Instead of escalating the issue, the manager asked him to continue monitoring the situation quietly. With a new CEO taking over the next morning, nobody wanted to trigger a major security incident before the leadership transition. Andrew understood the risk was far greater than anyone realized. Without waiting for approval, he began building temporary defensive layers throughout the live system. He manually redirected suspicious traffic, isolated compromised components, and created emergency protection without interrupting the company's operations. The infrastructure was too old and too interconnected to shut down safely, leaving him no choice but to defend it while it remained fully active. For the next 48 hours, Andrew barely left the operations center. He survived on coffee, vending machine food, and short breaks between emergency fixes. Most of his co-workers assumed he was handling another difficult technical issue. None of them realized he was preventing an attack that could cripple the company's entire payment network. Late on the second night, Andrew uncovered the attacker's final trap. Hidden inside one of the processing clusters was a delayed trigger that would remain inactive until someone performed a routine system restart. If that happened, every temporary defense Andrew had built would disappear instantly, allowing the attackers to activate the next stage of their plan. Knowing the danger, Andrew carefully documented everything. He prepared detailed logs, technical notes, patch summaries, and one clear warning explaining that under no circumstances should anyone restart the core services before speaking with him. His plan was to deliver the information directly to executive leadership the following morning. But after nearly 2 days without real sleep, his body finally reached its limit. As the morning shift approached, Andrew lowered his head for what was meant to be only a brief moment, while the monitoring screens continued scrolling around him. Minutes later, Olivia Bennett walked into the operations center for the first time as CEO. Keep watching, because the real danger is already hiding inside the system. Olivia Bennett arrived at the operations center at 7:45 on her first morning as CEO. Instead of beginning with presentations from department heads, she wanted to see the company's critical infrastructure exactly as it operated each day. As she walked past rows of engineers finishing the overnight shift, one sight immediately caught her attention. At the center console, a man sat asleep, with his head resting on his arms. Around him, dozens of monitors displayed scrolling logs, system alerts, and status indicators that meant little to someone unfamiliar with the infrastructure. To Olivia, however, the scene represented everything she intended to change. She believed she was looking at a culture that had become careless and unaccountable. Without asking a single question, she read the employee's badge and called out his name. Andrew Foster slowly lifted his head, still struggling to regain consciousness after nearly 2 days without real sleep. Before he could explain anything, Olivia spoke firmly. This company does not pay anyone to sleep on the job. The entire operations floor fell silent. Andrew immediately recognized the new CEO. Fighting through exhaustion, he tried to speak. "You need to hear what I have to say about the core payment cluster." Olivia interrupted him before he could finish. "I don't need to hear anything on my first morning." She instructed security to collect his access badge and told human resources to begin the termination process immediately. Andrew looked at her with urgency rather than anger. He understood that the company's survival depended on information only he possessed. He made one final attempt. If someone restarts the system, once again, Olivia cut him off. She had already turned toward the security officer walking across the room. "I've said everything I'm going to say." No one spoke. Several engineers standing nearby knew Andrew had barely left the operations floor for the previous 48 hours. They had seen him working continuously through the night. Yet with the company's new CEO delivering her first public decision, nobody found the courage to challenge her. Without raising his voice or defending himself, Andrew slowly removed his access badge. Before leaving, he turned toward a younger engineer named Daniel and quietly said 4 words: "Do not restart it." Some employees assumed he was simply frustrated about losing his job. Others believed it was nothing more than a dramatic farewell. Olivia paid no attention to the warning. She considered the dismissal a necessary demonstration of leadership. In her mind, the company needed clear standards from the very beginning, and allowing an employee to sleep at the most important workstation would send exactly the wrong message. Andrew walked out of the building completely exhausted. More than losing his job, he was worried that he had never been allowed to explain the danger hidden inside the system. Behind him, the operations center continued functioning normally. The temporary defensive layers Andrew had spent 2 days building quietly absorbed suspicious network traffic without attracting attention. Because everything still appeared stable, many supervisors concluded that firing him had caused no real problem. Meanwhile, several engineers opened the technical repository where Andrew had stored his emergency notes. The files contained warnings, patch references, and detailed annotations written while he worked under enormous pressure. They understood pieces of what he had documented, but no one fully grasped the entire strategy he had created to keep the infrastructure running safely. Shortly before noon, one of the payment processing clusters began responding more slowly than usual. Transactions started accumulating in the queue, creating delays that looked similar to ordinary system congestion. The on-duty supervisor decided the simplest solution was to perform a routine restart, a procedure that had solved similar issues many times before. As he prepared the command, Daniel hesitated. He told us not to restart it. The supervisor barely looked up. He's been terminated. With that single sentence, Andrew's warning lost all authority. The restart command was executed. At first, everything seemed to improve. Queue times dropped, and the temporary slowdown disappeared. The supervisor relaxed, believing the issue had been resolved. But only moments later, the authentication system began behaving unpredictably. Payment sessions started losing synchronization. Transactions entered incomplete states. Routing services stopped communicating correctly, and the invisible defensive layers Andrew had built disappeared the instant the restart cleared them from memory. The attacker's hidden trigger had finally been activated. Without realizing it, the company had opened the exact doorway Andrew had spent 48 hours trying to keep closed. Don't leave yet, because one wrong command could destroy everything. The restart command was executed just before the afternoon trading window reached full volume. For a brief moment, everything appeared normal. The queue cleared faster, response times improved, and the supervisor believed the slowdown had been resolved. Then, almost without warning, the payment infrastructure began to fail. Authentication services started falling out of sync. Transactions entered incomplete states, unable to finish or roll back correctly. Routing paths behaved unpredictably. As the temporary defenses Andrew had spent 48 hours building disappeared the instant the system restarted. The attacker's hidden trigger had activated exactly as he had warned. Within minutes, engineers realized they were no longer dealing with a routine technical issue. Critical payment traffic began moving in unexpected directions, and several high-value transactions could no longer be verified. Monitoring tools showed errors spreading across the network faster than anyone could understand them. The operations team reacted immediately. They attempted rollbacks, isolated affected services, and searched for ways to restore stability. But every solution created new problems because the system no longer matched the documentation they were following. The infrastructure had evolved over many years through emergency fixes and partial upgrades. Much of the knowledge existed only in Andrew's experience. Without him, the engineers understood pieces of the architecture, but nobody could see how every part depended on the others. Someone opened Andrew's repository of technical notes. The files were filled with timestamps, patch records, warning annotations, and emergency documentation written while he fought the intrusion almost alone. As the engineers read through the material, they realized something unsettling. Andrew had predicted every stage of the failure they were now witnessing. Understanding his notes, however, was very different from being able to reproduce what he had done. By early afternoon, Olivia Bennett was called back to the operations center. When she entered the room for the second time that day, it looked nothing like it had that morning. The calm atmosphere had vanished. Nearly every monitor displayed warning messages. Engineers moved rapidly between workstations while client calls continued arriving one after another. Olivia asked what had happened. A senior engineer looked up from his console before answering quietly. It looks like Andrew was holding this entire system together by himself for the last 2 days. The words stopped the room. Another engineer explained that the restart had removed every temporary protection Andrew had created. The attack he had been containing was now spreading through the company's payment infrastructure. Olivia immediately asked whether the system could be recovered. No one answered with confidence. The engineers possessed talent and experience, but they did not possess Andrew's complete understanding of the legacy infrastructure. The documentation was incomplete. The architecture was too complicated, and the person who knew every hidden dependency had been escorted out of the building only hours earlier. Daniel then showed Olivia the folder Andrew had prepared before falling asleep. Inside were detailed logs, technical summaries, patch annotations, and one final warning written in plain language so it could not be misunderstood. At the bottom of the document was a single message: "If I am no longer available, do not restart the core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Call me first." Beneath the warning was Andrew's phone number. Nobody had called it. Olivia read the sentence again. For the first time since becoming CEO, she stopped trying to solve the situation and simply faced the truth. That morning, Andrew had tried to explain. She had never allowed him to finish a single sentence. She remembered the urgency in his voice, the way he tried again and again to warn her, and how confidently she had dismissed him before hearing any evidence. She had believed she understood what she was seeing. Instead, she had fired the one person preventing a catastrophe. After several unanswered phone calls, Olivia asked Human Resources for Andrew's home address. Minutes later, she drove there herself. The apartment was modest and quiet, far removed from the executive offices she had spent the day in. She knocked once. No answer. She knocked again. This time the door slowly opened. A little girl stood there, holding a worn stuffed rabbit. She looked calmly at Olivia. "Are you looking for my dad?" Olivia hadn't known Andrew had a daughter. At work, he had never spoken about his personal life or used it to gain sympathy. He had simply done his job. Chloe stepped aside and quietly invited her inside. Andrew was asleep on the sofa exactly as he had collapsed after returning home. He was still wearing the same clothes from work. His laptop remained open beside him, and a glass of water sat untouched on the table. The apartment reflected a simple life, built around necessity rather than comfort. Nothing suggested laziness. Everything suggested exhaustion. Lowering her voice, Chloe spoke gently. "Daddy hasn't really slept. He said something bad was happening at work. He promised he'd rest after he fixed it." Those simple words struck Olivia harder than anything she had heard all day. She finally understood what she had judged that morning. She had seen a man asleep. She had never seen the 48 hours that came before it. She had mistaken sacrifice for neglect. Looking around the apartment, Olivia realized Andrew had been carrying two responsibilities almost entirely alone. He was protecting one of the country's largest payment systems while raising a young daughter who depended on him every day. The certainty she had felt that morning now seemed painfully misplaced. She quietly asked Chloe if she could wake her father. It took several attempts before Andrew slowly opened his eyes. When he recognized Olivia standing in his living room, he did not look angry. He simply looked exhausted. Olivia sat across from him. "I didn't listen to you this morning," she said. "I fired you before I understood what was happening. I'm sorry." Andrew remained silent. There was nothing he could say that would undo what had already happened. Olivia continued. "They restarted the system. Nobody understands your defensive work well enough to stop what's happening." Andrew closed his eyes briefly. He had hoped they would remember his warning. Instead, they had done exactly what he feared. Without wasting another moment, he opened the monitoring software on his laptop and reviewed the system's condition. Less than a minute later, he quietly closed the screen. The numbers confirmed everything. The attack had entered its active stage. Before saying anything else, Andrew turned toward Chloe. He asked whether she had eaten lunch, finished her homework, and whether the neighbor would stay with her. Chloe answered yes to each question. Only then did Andrew look back at Olivia. "I'm going back because if this breach succeeds, innocent people will suffer. Businesses, workers, and customers will pay for mistakes they didn't make." He paused before adding one final sentence. "I'm not going back because of the apology." Olivia nodded. She understood. Andrew changed into a clean shirt, picked up his laptop, quietly said goodbye to Chloe, and followed Olivia back to headquarters. Neither of them spoke during the drive. Both understood that every passing minute gave the attackers more time. The next decisions would determine whether Aurelius Pay survived the worst crisis in its history. Stay with the story, because Olivia is about to learn the truth too late. When Andrew returned to Aurelius Pay, the atmosphere inside the operations center changed immediately. No one celebrated, yet the sense of relief was obvious. The engineers knew the person who understood the system better than anyone else had come back. Andrew walked straight to the primary console without saying a word. Someone stood up and gave him the seat. He connected his laptop, requested the latest system logs, and asked the team to summarize everything they had attempted since the restart. He listened carefully without interrupting. Once the briefing ended, he remained silent for a few seconds, organizing the situation in his mind. Then he began assigning work. One group was instructed to isolate the suspicious outbound connections without shutting them down completely. Another team was told to build a mirror environment so they could trace exactly where the redirected payment traffic was going. A third group prepared a controlled failover for the most critical payment services, while another engineer documented every command Andrew issued so nothing would be lost. He also asked the legal department to contact the company's largest corporate clients with a carefully prepared statement acknowledging a temporary technical issue while avoiding unnecessary panic. There was no confusion in his instructions. Andrew wasn't guessing. He already understood the structure of the attack because he had spent the previous 48 hours studying it while building temporary defenses to contain it. Now he simply had to rebuild those protections under far more difficult conditions. The room became remarkably quiet. Every engineer focused on the task in front of them, while Andrew coordinated the recovery. Little by little, the situation began to improve. The abnormal routing pathways were identified and separated from the company's core payment network. Suspended transactions were isolated before any funds could be redirected outside the verified system. One by one, the attackers' access points were eliminated as Andrew restored the authentication layers they had been waiting to exploit. There were still losses. Several transaction batches would require manual review, and the company would need to notify affected enterprise clients. A full security investigation would also follow, but the worst outcome had been prevented. The attackers never gained full control of the payment infrastructure. After confirming that the authentication services were stable again and the intrusion pathway had been permanently closed, Andrew finally leaned back from the console. For the first time that day, the operations center breathed again. Within the hour, an emergency executive review was called. Department heads, the chief technology officer, senior managers, and members of the board gathered in the main conference room to examine exactly what had happened. The timeline was presented step by step. Andrew had detected the suspicious activity 2 days earlier. He had reported it through the proper management channel. Instead of escalating the warning, leadership had delayed action. Andrew had then spent 48 hours building emergency protections while keeping the company's payment systems operating normally. On the very morning he intended to brief executive leadership, he had fallen asleep from exhaustion after working continuously for 2 days. Before he could explain the situation, he had been dismissed. After his departure, his warning had been ignored. The restart had been performed exactly as he feared. Everything that followed matched the danger he had documented in advance. Several executives attempted to describe the crisis as a combination of communication failures and procedural weaknesses during a leadership transition. Olivia listened quietly. She understood what that language was trying to accomplish. It spread responsibility broadly enough that no individual decision appeared to matter. But she also knew that using those explanations would only repeat the same mistake she had made that morning. She stood before everyone in the room. This morning, I fired Andrew Foster, before allowing him to finish a single sentence. The room became completely silent. I made that decision based only on what I believed I was seeing. I never asked a question. I never listened. I was wrong, and my decision nearly caused a disaster this company might not have survived. She turned toward Andrew. I'm sorry. There was no attempt to defend herself, no effort to shift blame, only a straightforward acknowledgement of her mistake. Andrew met her eyes for a moment. He didn't respond with anger, nor did he make a speech. He simply gave a small nod. The apology could not erase what had happened, but it was honest. Over the following weeks, the board moved quickly to recognize Andrew's contribution. They offered him a promotion, increased compensation, and a newly created leadership role overseeing infrastructure security across the organization. Andrew listened carefully before answering. Surprisingly, the first thing he negotiated was not his salary or his title. He asked for structural changes. He wanted frontline engineers to have a direct path to executive leadership whenever they identified serious security risks, without being blocked by layers of management. He requested formal shift rotation standards so that no engineer would ever again be forced to carry such an enormous responsibility alone for days without proper rest. He also proposed clear protections for employees who raised legitimate security concerns, ensuring they would never face professional consequences simply for reporting dangerous problems. The board listened carefully. Everyone understood what Andrew was doing. After everything that had happened, he was using the influence he had earned, not to benefit himself, but to protect the next person who might one day stand in the same position. Olivia approved every recommendation without hesitation. The changes were implemented throughout the company. But the most important transformation was not written in any policy. It happened inside Olivia herself. She remained decisive and continued expecting high standards. Yet she no longer believed appearances told the whole story. Instead of assuming she already knew the answers, she began asking questions. She spent time with different departments, listening before making decisions and encouraging employees to speak honestly about problems they encountered. Gradually, she learned to recognize the difference between people who talked confidently about their work and those who quietly carried responsibilities that few others even noticed. Several weeks later, Olivia passed through the company's main lobby at the end of the day. She noticed Andrew kneeling beside Chloe, adjusting the strap on her small backpack while listening patiently as she excitedly described something that had happened at school. It was a side of him Olivia had never seen inside the office. The calm, focused engineer who had saved the company was also a devoted father whose greatest priority had always been his daughter. Olivia waited until they finished talking before walking over. In her hand was Chloe's stuffed rabbit, the one she had accidentally taken with her when she visited their apartment during the crisis. She smiled and handed it back. Chloe's face immediately lit up as she hugged the toy tightly. Andrew thanked Olivia with a quiet smile. There were no dramatic speeches, no perfect ending, only two people who had learned difficult lessons about responsibility, trust, and the importance of listening before judging. Andrew had regained the respect he never asked for. Olivia had gained a kind of leadership no title alone could provide. And in the ordinary brightness of the company lobby, with Chloe holding her favorite rabbit once again, both of them walked away, carrying something far more valuable than a professional victory. A deeper understanding that true leadership begins by listening before reaching a conclusion. In the weeks that followed, Aurelius Pay gradually returned to normal operations, but the company itself was no longer the same. Andrew Foster's actions had not only prevented a devastating financial crisis, but it also exposed weaknesses that had remained hidden for years. The board formally recognized his contribution, offering him a senior leadership position, increased compensation, and full authority over the company's infrastructure security. Andrew accepted the responsibility, but before discussing titles or salary, he made 3 requests. First, engineers reporting serious security threats would always have a direct path to executive leadership. Second, shift rotation policies would ensure no employee could become a single point of failure through exhaustion. Third, anyone raising legitimate security concerns would be protected rather than discouraged. The board approved every recommendation. For Andrew, the greatest reward was never recognition. It was knowing that no one else would have to face the same situation alone. Olivia Bennett also changed. She remained decisive, but she learned that leadership was not measured by how quickly decisions were made. It was measured by the willingness to listen before reaching them. Instead of assuming she already understood every situation, she began visiting departments, asking questions, and encouraging honest conversations with the people doing the work every day. Gradually, she learned to recognize those who quietly carried responsibilities that rarely appeared on reports or organizational charts. Several weeks later, Olivia saw Andrew in the company lobby, helping Chloe adjust her backpack after school. The serious engineer who had calmly guided the company through its worst crisis looked completely different beside his daughter. His attention belonged entirely to her. Olivia walked over carrying Chloe's stuffed rabbit, the one she had accidentally taken from the apartment during the emergency. Chloe smiled immediately as she hugged it tightly. Andrew thanked Olivia with a quiet smile. Nothing more needed to be said. The crisis had passed. Andrew's reputation had been restored, and Olivia had learned the most important lesson of her career. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never ask to be noticed. Sometimes the greatest mistakes happen when we judge someone before hearing their story. And sometimes the difference between failure and survival begins with something as simple as listening. If this life lesson touched you, subscribe for more emotional stories about judgment, humility, and second chances.